session is a little different today. It is a session focusing on the literature review process. And I'm joined by Dr. Roland Hegarty, who is going to share some of his wise words and wisdom around the literature review process for undergrad students who are level 5 and level 6. The module itself is focusing on really on the key principles that make for a good literature review. And by the end of this, really, I just wanted you to have some key skills and principles in place that would allow you to go and conduct a literature review that, for me, is the key foundation to any good research piece. So we're going to really just start with what a literature review is and how the terminology is often one that is quite scary to some students, but when done correctly, it should be an enjoyable process and is the foundation to any good research piece. So, first things first, I'll probably ask Roland to just give his overview of what he perceives to be a literature review and the purpose of one, really, in a research schedule and as a student.
Okay, hello everybody. Let me start by telling you what I think a literature review is. Okay, you need to imagine it as though you've done a wealth of reading. It's a bit like if you can imagine you were listening to a whole lot of music and you wanted to put music into different sort of genres and into different categories. And you were then trying to communicate what those categories were and what changes there were in that music to somebody that was not in the know. And to a degree, a literature review is a bit like this. You're going to do a wealth of reading, and from that wealth of reading, you're going to categorize the various literatures. So in effect, you can actually communicate that to somebody that would not necessarily be in the know. In simple English, I am not going to read around the subject area. That is what you're going to read around. And somehow or other, you've got to educate me in a kind of concise manner. What do you think, Alex? Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think if we're being honest, we can't talk about the literature review as standalone. We have to tell you where it fits into the bigger picture. And Roland sort of hit the nail on the head there. When you are conducting a literature review in the research process, you're going to have to read a hell of a lot. And it really does hammer home the essence of choosing a topic that, first of all, you have the practicalities to complete some research on a particular area. That is, for me, one of the most important things.
Sorry, Alex, do you have the same rule of thumb as us, that approximately for every 100 words that you have given in a word count, you should have at least one relevant literature reviewed?
Yeah.
So in effect, in our place, we have students doing dissertations that are between 10 to 12,000 words. So we would automatically expect a literature that would be comprising somewhere around maybe 100 to 120 references.
Yeah.
Is that similar for yourselves?
Yeah, I was about to say, really, it's our literature review portion of the dissertation would be around 2,000 words if they're doing what's called a research article. So they are looking at very similar sort of numbers. And I'll always remember Roland telling me this, and it has stuck with me and been brilliant advice all the way throughout my career. He mentioned about reading an article a night before bed every single night during his final year of study. And that doesn't mean that's all you read, but that is the bare minimum and the principle as a must. And I always say, first of all, if it's a boring article, it'll help you sleep. So there's a bit of practicality involved. But second of all, it is a good habit to get into and focuses you on making sure you read around your project. And there's so many ways, and I get students all the time asking me for around shortcuts about this. You can't really shortcut a literature review, can you? You have to put in the hard hours.
The reality as well, and I hate to say this, there's some literatures a lot of literatures, in fact, you'll read that you won't use. So even if you're going to decide that you're going to use 50 literatures or 100 literatures or whatever, you might have to read 3 or 4 times that amount. I think it was Saunders and the others that he works with, Lewis and Thornhill, that actually suggested that for every literature you use, you have to read 4 other literatures to get to that. So it gives you some idea of the volume that Alex was referring to in terms of what's required for constructing or even making a start on a literature review. But, and here's the real important bit, that is not something to be afraid of. If you're somebody that's not a reader, if you're somebody that's not sort of comfortable with reading big volumes, then space it out exactly as Alex said, one literature, maybe two a day. And what have you got? You, in a week, you've suddenly got 7 or 14 articles read. And over the course of a month, you're suddenly looking at 40 plus articles.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, really. And it's something that cannot be rushed, unfortunately. It is definitely a labour of love, and that really emphasises the importance of choosing a topic that's practical and is something that you love. It is choosing an area that you are essentially committing yourself to for months on end, that you are willing to read around this. And students always say to me, well, what is the real purpose of a literature review? And I always say the same thing. You are telling me a story and identifying the need for your work, where I can read your literature review. And this is what Roland said to me years back. It shouldn't be a surprise, the area that you're going to go to, because you're leading me on to the punch. You are continuously shaping the literature that makes it crystal clear that there is a particular area that needs focus or needs attention and detail.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Alex is saying. And just before we came sort of live on this, we were discussing about how literature review can almost be a dirty word for many students. Listen, let me try and put your hearts a little bit at ease with this one. You should not be in any way afraid of what a literature review is. In fact, it's something you should embrace. And if you do it well, the rest of a piece of research, be that an extensive dissertation or otherwise, becomes that much easier. And I've often likened it, and I'm sure Alex might remember me saying this in the past as well. Imagine you're going to paint a wall. The preparation is what counts. It's about getting that wall ready for the paint. And if you do that correctly, the painting is actually quite a privilege and almost a joy to a degree. That's when you see the real results. But if you don't do the preparation, and in this context, if you don't do the reading, then you're going to struggle and fight the rest of your literature, without doubt.
Yeah, it's essentially like trying to build a house on poor foundations. Okay, it makes it incredibly hard for you to conduct a decent research project without the foundation put in place. And the other key practicality tip here is to read other academic papers where they have reviewed the literature. And if you can start to highlight some fundamentals and key principles, it's consistent across all types of academic work. A good literature review clearly highlights seminal work in the area. It clearly highlights areas that need future discussion. It clearly summarises the key findings of the particular area over a period of time. And this can be found whether we are looking at sport, whether we are looking at business, whether we are looking at tourism and travel, whatever it is, the key foundations of a good literature review is consistent. So one of the first things I would suggest really is to read other pieces of work around literature reviews. And there's only so much reading about how to do it that can be done. It's good to read other people's work and see how it's done, but there has to become a time where you dive in and you start to get findings down on paper.
Yeah, again, I would second what Alex is saying there. And I want to give you a sort of strange analogy. For most of you, you're sports students of some shape or form. And for years, you've practiced that particular sport. So today, you can turn on your TVs and watch a game of football or watch a game of rugby or whatever it is your sport is. And you can identify immediately an area of weakness on that particular field of play. You can see the left back is weak, or the goalkeeper is not as strong as they should be, or the striker's only got 1 foot. You can identify those areas that need to be improved. But that comes with practice, years of practice doing your particular sport. The problem with constructing a literature review is that for most of you, you will not have put in that years of practice of doing the literature, of doing the actual reading. And therefore the review process can be problematic. And the only way around that, and as Alex said, there's no shortcut, is you've got to make a start. So you start small, start with a sort of gentle opening, read the article, see if you can analyze it, see if you can review it, see if you can identify things that are good, see if you can identify things that are bad. That's simple. Move on, try another article. And eventually you'll start to move away from things that are good and bad, and you'll start to look at things that are critical and things that are sort of less critical or less constructive, etc. And that's all to do with just practicing it.
Yeah. Nobody starts out doing these things and are brilliant at them straight away. I certainly wasn't. But you're not supposed to be either. You're supposed to start off and you are a little unsure. You're supposed to just be able to read the literature to start with, and all you can comment on is your own personal view, whether you agree or you disagree. And as I've said to the students all year, you need to go beyond how you think and how you feel. You need to provide a little bit of evidence for that. And can you then start to take these little paragraphs that you're working on, and rather than read an article and say, this is the good points, this is the key points, essentially like a jigsaw puzzle, can you then use that summary and fit it in with another summary that you've read? And can you then start to tell the story? Can you start to shape your argument? And if I was to say, for me, what a literature review is, in a couple of sentences, it is telling a story about the previous work that has been done in your area that is based in an argument that your work needs looking at. Agreed? Missed anything?
No, I totally agree, and I love the fact that you use that sort of illustrative of doing a jigsaw or a puzzle, because that's exactly what a literature review is. When you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, there is a rule of thumb in terms of how you do it. You usually turn over all the pieces, step one. You then start to structure the outside frame of it. You then start to put all the said yellow colors and all the said green colors and all the said blue colors together, so you can start to form where they're likely to go, etc. And that's exactly what you're doing here. You're creating, if you will, a means in which to actually construct that literature review. And Alex is right. We all start with basic knowledge. We all have to start somewhere, and we build upon that. But if you start to do it, if you start to practice it, it does become a little bit easier. And just look for the things, as Alex said, just look for those arguments that you think are in positive or negative or in favor or against what you're looking at. And
if we were to use the analogy there and provide practical recommendations, of the first thing that we all do with a puzzle is turn them over. The first thing that we do there is we start to read. We start to read everything around that we can get our hands on, and then we could start to find all the corners and the edges. But what we could then do is start to piece together the relevant stuff, because like Roland said, a lot of the stuff we read won't be relevant. And from my personal experience, the way in which you will soon start to see academic pieces of work repeated in various articles. And they start to become the cornerstone and the key pieces of work for your area. So you then go and read them, and then you go and understand what they're doing. And then you can start to see, who are they citing? Who are they building on the work for? And what you're doing is really trying to paint the picture and set the scene, and start to group all these literatures into different groups where you are telling the story, and you sort of start broad. And you start with, this is the overall consensus of what the literature says, and then you start to go into the different avenues that you want to specifically explore. And it doesn't have to be groundbreaking, and you're not going to win a Nobel Prize, and you don't need to identify this huge gap. It needs to be subtly different, but it doesn't need to be something that nobody has ever done and thought about before, because Roland once said to me, there's probably a reason for that. That if it hasn't been explored for the last 40, 50 years, there's probably a reason. So you need to make a subtle contribution, but that is still a contribution.
It's the same way as when I was referring to Saunders a little bit earlier, and he was suggesting that you have to read 3 or 4 maybe different articles before you find one useful. Actually, that's not a waste of time by any means, because the only way you know that it's not useful is by reading it in the first place. And every article that you read will have some value, regardless of what that value is. It will have some value. And it is worth stressing this one, okay? When you're reading an article, I like to call this housekeeping. So when you read an article, okay, have yourself a pen and have yourself a highlighter. Highlight those sections that are really important. And with your pen, write down next to it why, when you were reading it, you thought it was important. Okay, because when you've read 20, 30, 40, 100 articles, will you remember that first one or the second one or the fifth one you read? You won't. But if you put it into your own simple understanding, and at your moment in time what you were thinking, then it'll make a lot more sense to you. And the final thing I do in terms of my housekeeping of literatures, I get a packet of post-it notes, and on the front of each article I've read, I stick a post-it note. And in some sort of 10, 12, 20 words, I write down what that article was about and why I'm going to keep it. And what really happens then, what makes it really easy, is that when you've got 50, 60, 100 articles read, you can start to do exactly what we were saying earlier, that jigsaw. You can start to put all the positives together, all the negatives together. You can put those ones that even couldn't come up with an argument together. So now you're beginning to start to see how the actual jigsaw is taking place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, really. And I think the important thing from that, in sticking with the post-it notes, is you can all read an article and you can all state whether you enjoyed it or not. But if you could, from one article, take something away that you want to include in your study. If you liked it, why did you like it? Were they clear with their message? Did they set it out in a particular way? Did they critique an article that you thought, yes, I understand what it means to be critical. They've done it in a crystal clear way. And if you can just take one good thing from each article and take the best and be able to summarize it. And this is the other thing that for me is vital. When you are dealing with supervisors and when you are tackling this project, the dissertation, it's your baby. And essentially, you want to become the so-called mini expert in this field, and you want to be able to cite papers that we wouldn't have read before, your supervisors wouldn't have read before, and get to the stage. Roland will tell you this. I go to Roland with advice about ideas and all sorts of stuff, and it will start with that I'll present something to him and he'll say, oh no, think about doing this if you think about doing that. And at the start, I'll go, yeah, fair enough, I'll go and have a look. But by the end of it, once I've read my literature, Roland will say, think about doing this. And I can say no, because it's been done before. Somebody has expressed it more clearly, the reasons why. And you want to be able to read enough so that you can defend your study and your position, that it is valid, rather than simply turning over and saying, oh yeah, I'll go and check that, which for me indicates that you haven't done enough reading. You want to be able to defend it. Do you agree?
Oh, completely. Absolutely. It's all about defense. Listen, I'm going to give you another sort of analogy, if you will. Let's imagine that we all went to the cinema and we watched some movie. I know that's a little bit difficult in these COVID restricted times, but imagine otherwise, okay? And we're all at the movies and we watched the movie, and afterwards when we come out, we had to discuss it. Would all of us agree that we liked that movie? The chances are probably not, okay? So immediately we could divide you into two, those that liked the movie and those that didn't like the movie. But we wouldn't leave it there, would we? Let's be honest. We would then go back to those people that liked the movie and we'd ask why they liked the movie. And you might have some people turn around and say they liked it because of the plot. You might have other people turn around and say they liked it because Megan Fox starred in it or whatever it happened to be. So you're now beginning to branch away from just having the like into sort of subcategories. Now you do the very same with those people that disliked it. Why did you dislike it? And they might turn around and say, I hated the plot, or I don't like Megan Fox as an actress, or whatever it happens to be. So now what you've got is conflicting viewpoints, not just I like or dislike, but an actual critical appreciation of those viewpoints. And if we can do it, and we do this, and don't be embarrassed or shy to say that you don't analyze movies, we all do it, or a book, or music, whatever it happens to be. Then if you can do it in those walks of life, what Alex and myself are trying to get you to do here is to consider that when you're reading a literature. What did you like about the literature? Good. Now expand upon that. And that's what creates your argument and debate.
Yeah, it's spot on. And one of the first things that I normally like to do is I like to read my 15 and 20 articles. And I like to have some pathway about the story that I want to tell. I think Roland used a phrase to me before, and it was about the horse was leading you rather than you leading the horse. And he's essentially referring to heading down a blind alley when you've got no clue of what the final destination should be. And that's not to say that you read the literature just trying to choose the thing that fits your argument. No, but there must be some logical flow to the story that you're telling based on the reading that you do. You don't want to be simply going down, because I've seen some literature reviews that go so broad and so wide and they end up with something that I don't really know the message that they're trying to convey. So it is about doing the good, the bad, the why, the categories and the groupings.
Sorry, Alex, I'm going to just cut in there. Interestingly, you just said that sometimes you've read a literature review that's so broad and encompassing you can't really understand where it's going, what it's about. The irony of the situation, that is not a literature review. The whole concept of a review is to be concise. The whole concept and idea of a review is to just pick out the most relevant points to discuss. So if it's going to be a big, broad, expansive piece of work, then arguably it could suggest that piece you're reading wasn't a review in the first place.
Yeah.
Indeed, I have to share one last thing before you continue again. We don't call it a literature review because students get a bit confused. We actually now call it a critique. Okay. We actually critique the literature.
Yeah.
And what we mean by critique is actually offer a critical appreciation. And that critical appreciation is as simple as, did I like it? Did I not like it? If I liked it, what did I like? What were those subsections? And that's it. So again, not to be afraid of words like critique or literature. They are words that you will become comfortable, and you are probably already comfortable with.
Again, to develop that even further, moving on to our third year, some of the forms that you have to fill in for a dissertation, the terminology is interchangeable. Sometimes we call it the literature review, and in the form we call it background and rationale. And I think that says exactly really what the essence of a literature review is. It's telling me, the reader, what has been said previously and the reason why your topic is so important to be looked at. Right, so you've been through that. This is just sort of more some tips that for me is important and vital. The other thing that I've just been reminded of from that discussion, one area that I see students do quite a lot of is simply describing what they have just read. Okay, and that for me is the first layer of analysis. You've concisely, not all the time, but the better of that would concisely say this is what the work is. Okay, like Roland says, that is not a review in the essence of being critical. It is simply having the ability to describe what you've just read. And I'm not entirely sure that that is a particularly strong skill to have. I think most people can read something and tell me what it was about. But we now need to develop that and go a little deeper and a little layering. Obviously, like Roland says, the next layer is to say, why? Why are we feeling this way about it? And what do we like about it? And what do we not like about it?
Again, completely and utterly agree with this. You said at the top, I think Alex said this was for level 5 and level 6 students. If you're still in the remit of being descriptive, there is nothing wrong with having a degree of description. I think that's important. We do need to set the scene, and no matter who you are, you have to have a certain element of description to do that. But it's very important that you move beyond the description. At level 4, we're normally quite comfortable and happy for you to stay almost within a descriptive level. But by level 5, and certainly by level 6, the description should play the least part, and you should be moving into evaluating, analyzing, critiquing. And they're not dirty words. They're not words to be afraid of in any shape or form whatsoever, because you do it every day of the week. Simple example. In the morning time when you get up and you dress, you put on your clothes, okay? Believe it or not, you're being critical and you're being analytical.
Yeah.
Why? Because you might decide, okay, I'm wearing this outfit because I'm going to university, because I'm not feeling confident today and I'm feeling fat and ugly, because, I don't know, there might be a multitude of reasons. Maybe you've got an interview, maybe you're going to sport, maybe there is a reason. You're being critical as to why you choose a particular outfit. Yeah. And that is something we practice in every walk of life. And again, we just want you to extend that into looking at literatures.
Yeah. And for me, it sort of touches on the first point there around even choosing the clothing. You wouldn't be cynical with yourself and you wouldn't say, I'm not wearing that coat because it looks horrible. You might be skeptical that, well, actually, does that coat match the trousers or does that coat match the shoes? And that's the difference. The same with the literature. And another trap that students seem to fall down is when they think they mean critical, all they do is be negative and they say everything that's wrong with it. And that's not what it means to be critical. If you look a little further down, it's a fair evaluation and assessment based that is grounded in logic and reason, rather than simply a personal opinion or a personal experience around something. But you might have read something elsewhere and you might be able to provide a little bit of evidence to what you are stating. And really, if I can ask the question compared to what, and you don't have a valid answer, then we need to develop our reading a little bit more.
My favorite, sorry, Alex,
Yeah.
my favorite word out of this slide is that one four-letter word called fair. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're doing in terms of a literature review. You're trying to give a fair, and a fair means a balanced, it means a sort of objective opinion as to what you're reading. And I agree completely with Alex earlier when he was suggesting you need a direction. Of course you need a direction, but it shouldn't be to the point of where you now become impartial and you become subjective. You still need to remain fair in what you're reading. And that fairness should have a degree of being critical, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be dismissive. It can be positive without being sort of all singing, all dancing. It is about finding that sort of comfortable fairness in anything that you're reading.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably spot on. And if you want like a real example of that, you could be looking at some literature on technology in sport and running shoes. And there was a key piece of research done by Hegarty and Kay in 1993 that reviewed the literature around technology in sport and provided clear direction for future research. Brilliant. However, the literature is almost 20 years old. That is the healthy skepticism of this is the time and the place. It was valuable. It set out a research agenda, perhaps. It showed clear direction and summarized it. However, is that still applicable 20 years on? That's our bit. That's our criticality.
Alex, the ready-made example as to what you're referring to there would be Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Back in the 1940s and 50s when that was published, it was fantastically up to date. It was post-Second World War. Now, if you think about the very basic level of that, it had basic needs, food, shelter, etc. If you look now in the year 2020, we don't have to thankfully worry about food. We go to the local grocery store. Or we don't have to worry about shelter. Thankfully, most of us have homes and houses and student accommodation to live in, etc. And you can pick apart each level of his hierarchy accordingly. But back when it was produced, it was seminal in its work because at that time it was so significant. But as Alex rightly just suggested, it is fair to criticize Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the light of today's 21st century. It's very simply outmoded. It's outdated. Put it in simple English, today's basic needs are a mobile phone, an iPhone of some
Wi-Fi.
sort. Yeah, exactly. Wi-Fi and holidays. Yeah. So things have changed. Now, does that mean that you're being unfair? No, it's giving it a healthy sense of sort of fairness. You're basically appreciating it. And one other note just before we move on from that one, students have a tendency to think the great Maslow, I can't criticize Maslow, or I can't criticize Alex Kay, or I can't criticize Roland Hegarty. They're far superior. But you can, okay? You're not criticizing them personally. You're criticizing the work that they've written. And in this case, to do with Maslow's, you're criticizing the work purely on the basis of that its day has been. It's no longer applicable today. And that doesn't mean that you're criticizing Maslow. In fact, it's showing the reader that you've got a healthy sort of appreciation of their work and understanding going forward.
Yeah, that's spot on. And to be critical of it means you have to understand it, which is good. And the irony is Christ, do I read a lot of students' work still focusing on Maslow and the hierarchy of needs.
To be fair, I teach a lot of psychology. Any psychology book you buy today, the opening chapter will be Maslow, you know? But no, to be fair, Maslow, a fantastic starting point. And this is again worth maybe making reference to in the literature review. Great starting point, brilliant, but have the ability and have the knowledge and have the awareness to actually suggest it is only a starting point. We now need to move on from that because the world has moved on from it.
It leads perfectly for me that students always say, well, Alex, how far back do I go? And I always say, I don't want to give the answer, how long's a piece of string, but first of all, it depends on your study. For example, my particular area, there's a phrase in which that I use and is focused on my study. That phrase only got coined in 1989. So for me, I have a clear sort of benchmark. That doesn't mean that I don't look at anything before. I show an appreciation that it has sort of been mentioned here, there, but for me, the literature only starts at 1989. And depending on your area, say, for example, I've got a lot of students who want to look into financial fair play around the Premier League and stuff. So for me, a clear indication could be when the Premier League started, 92, 93. So these sort of things, it's all dependent on your work. And again, just to mention a point that Roland made, it's okay to be critical. Roland will never admit this, but Roland's a good friend of mine. He still denies it now, but we do not. There you go. See, we don't have a conversation where one of us is not critical of something that the other person says or does or presents. And that's not a bad thing at all, because first of all, it shows that we care enough to read it. So whether you criticize Maslow or not, you've appreciated that that's an important piece of work. So it required the reading to start with. And secondly, the only way which we ever move forward with a topic is by competition and criticism, in terms of always trying to push the boundaries and trying to eliminate as many potential weaknesses as we can. And it's important to have seminal work in terms of the essence of what they are trying to find, but it's not always applicable to us heading into 2021. So I think that is absolutely vital, really.
Yeah, just to sort of second what Alex was saying there, particularly with reference to how far back do you go in terms of literature, in terms of reading, that is a question. Honestly, if I had £1 for every student that has asked me over the last 20 years, I would be retired on some tropical island.
Yeah.
It is an incredibly difficult question to answer, purely because, as Alex said, well, how long is a piece of string? It completely depends on what you need that piece of string for. So it depends on what your study is. It depends on a multitude of different things. But, and this is just a tip source to the wise, generally speaking, there is a significant date and time in any issue that you're looking at. Alex made reference to the fair play argument. We could look at other issues, say, take for instance, sustainable development. You probably all remember the point in time where there was something like CFC gases and ozone layers, and it became almost topical and popular. Well, that's your starting point. Yeah. If you think about climate change, when did it really become such a hot topic of agenda? That is your point in time. Now, it's not to suggest you wouldn't look at things before that, but realistically, they're your setup. You're really going to be appreciating the issues that have happened since that point in time. Yeah. And it doesn't really matter. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree with me or not on this one, Alex, but I don't think there's any topic that doesn't have a significant time period where there was a significant change or a significant development or significant work that was written around it.
Yeah.
That is that kind of catalyst, that launch time.
And yes, spot on. And the other thing that's important for me is the world has been going on for a long time. And first of all, I have students now who want to particularly talk about the impact of COVID, and they think, well, it's so new that there won't be anything written on it. When I'm like, yeah, to some degree, you are right. It is so new and so fresh. The impact on it is still yet to be decided. However, this is not the first time we have ever suffered there are principles that are closely aligned with other worldwide events. And it's the same thing that we're referring to, like now when we're talking more about gender pay discrepancies, and we've started to talk about it since 2015, 2016. I've read a lot about work by a famous academic, Professor Thomas Sowell, who was making the same arguments in the 50s and the 60s. And you can start to do this where you look at key principles of your study and translate them to different areas. And when we're looking at financial fair play in football, well, we could start to also look at financial fair play in other sports and not be solely confined to just your small, narrow area. But within all of these, there will be key time periods, and it all depends. Roland, what's sort of the key time stamp for you with your PhD thesis?
Yeah, let me give you an example which might sort of reinforce what you're saying here, Alex. I have just launched an assignment with my students that was based on the Commonwealth Games 2022. And after I'd gone through all the launch and everything else, I had a student that came up to me after, and he said, how can we do this? The Games hasn't even happened yet. And it sort of reinforces what you're saying there, Alex, because this student missed the point. The way to do this is by looking at previous games, not just the Commonwealth Games, but previous World Cups. previous Rugby World Cups, previous Commonwealth Games, whatever it happens to be, previous events, that they can start to extrapolate the data and they can then start to compare it and contrast it. So it kind of reinforces what you're saying there, Alex, I'll be honest.
Yeah, and like, say for example, the COVID thing, okay, sort of an economic downturn. Well, is it worse than the recession in the 20s, in the 30s? Do you know what I mean? It's these sort of principles that they have been discovered before. You are not treading entirely on new ground. There are essences and principles that have been applied before that we can often forget about.
And there is the other way of looking at that as well, Alex, of course, is that if they're trying to look at a study that hasn't been necessarily done before, i.e. COVID around now, etc., and there isn't like for like, then there is also the issue with respect to the that actually sometimes it's best not to approach a subject like this. Sometimes it's better just to leave it, because if you take, for instance, the Olympics in 2012, in that point in time, everybody wanted to write around the Olympics in 2012, okay? But the reality is it's only now all the results of the Olympics is coming out. All the aftermath, all the legacy, all the participation rates. It's taken 8 years for that information to come. So maybe COVID is a great subject, but maybe not until maybe another 8, 9, 10 years down the road.
I agree, and I don't want to crush dreams, so to speak, but it is a fine line between a real passion that you want to go and look at and the practicalities of finishing a piece of work that has to be constructed and finished and ticked off within sort of 6 months. And you don't really want to be making it any harder for yourself than everything else that you've got going on.
And just before we leave this slide, just to reinforce what Alex was saying earlier as well, he made reference to the fact that you're not going to get a Nobel Prize for this. I'm not trying to be dismissive, and if you are a budding Einstein, well done. But the reality is, very simply, your research is going to add to already a mountain of research that's already there in any given topic. And as a result, think just purely from a personal and sort of, if you will, almost selfish viewpoint. I just want to get this done, path of least resistance, to get the best possible grade.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree, Alex?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. A completed piece far outweighs a very interesting area that is incomplete. You just have to sometimes do the thing that is going to get you through with the least resistance. Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. So shall we have a look at the next slide then, Alex?
Yep. Final slide. This has really just been collected from students that I've been speaking to over the few weeks. I think we will have covered most of these, but we will do our best to answer them anyway. So really, what are the different types of literature reviews, and do you have a preference for dissertations? That is a tough question.
Alex, may I start on this one, okay? What's important, okay? If you can imagine a literature review is a bit like an essay. I don't know if you agree with this, Alex, but I tell my students this, that forget a literature review, if you will, it's an essay that just requires more literature. And if you can kind of get into your head, an essay is something where you look at different sides of an argument, you look at trying to come up with a conclusion, then that's more or less what a literature review is. So in effect, what are the different types of literature review? Well, in effect, an essay to a degree is a type of a literature review. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. And I don't want any student of mine trying to overcomplicate things and try and do a fancy systematic review of the literature that from personal experience can take years to do well. Like Roland says, it's essentially at the level that we're working at now, we can look at a literature. And for me, the key point from as a marker's perspective and as a general reader is, has this student showcased an understanding of the literature? Yes. Have they situated where their potential study could fit in with the literature? Yes. And for me, those are two of the key principles. And have they been able to cast a critical eye over the current understanding and identify potential areas? For me, that's the most important thing, not whether we are looking at a narrative or a descriptive, etc. For me, I always suggest,
I think your third point there, Alex, by the way, was absolutely exactly, I couldn't have worded it better. absolutely bang on the money as to what a literature review is.
Yeah, that's it. So for me, we need to don't worry too much around the practicalities of what these titles are and is there a strict methodology to it. We definitely need inclusion and exclusion, and that's sort of something Roland and I spoke around in terms of timelines and timeframes. We will go over exactly how to select your literature, and if there is a method to our searching strategy, that's a different question. But around the types of literature reviews, keep it basic. There is nothing wrong with a narrative literature review where you are essentially telling the story that this is where your study fits in with the current understanding.
Great. The second point there, by the way, it says, how do I get started? This is an interesting one. There's a very simple answer to that: read. I've shared this with my students before. In the United Kingdom, you'll get your degree, hopefully all going well, and it'll be an outstanding degree. And when you do get your degree, it will say something that this student studied for a degree in whatever you're studying, okay? In America, I think they get this right, okay? They don't actually say you study for it. They say you successfully read for a degree. And I think they've got that absolutely bang on. It is about reading. So if you want to know how to get started in a literature review, it's really very simple. Read, 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 read. And just when you think you can't read anymore, read some more. It's that kind of process.
I agree. And to be honest, that mantra can take you as far as you want to go in academic work. Some of you will just want to do an undergrad and finish. Some of you want to do a master's. Some of the crazy fools will want to go even further. And the same principle applies no matter what. You have to read. You have to do your reading. You can't take any shortcuts to this.
And you know, if a literature review is actually sort of trial run for your further studies, then it's a great method. Great method.
I agree. I'm on to the next one. I keep being told I'm too descriptive rather than analytical. That has sort of been covered with what we are saying here around the different levels of appreciation for the text that you're reading. Okay, you are contributing more than just being able to interpret information and say it in a slightly different way. Okay, that's being descriptive. Like Roland says, that's level 4 standard now. And the key principles of being analytical, being critical, is the ability to string arguments together based on multiple sources, that you can make argumentative statements, not in a provocative way like you want a fight, but in a way that you can tell a story and shape an argument and tell me what's right about it and tell me what's wrong about it, and you are providing some logic and reason behind it rather than simply just saying this is what that person spoke about.
True. Listen, I can summarize this into real simple words, okay? Don't be afraid to ask why. Don't be afraid to challenge what you're reading. There is nothing wrong with it. There is no personal offense taken on any level. You are being a researcher and you're literally just challenging what you're seeing in the world around you. And believe it or not, and you'll have to believe Alex and I on this because we've got the experience perhaps, but you do it every day of the week. You go out to a restaurant and you sit down, you have food. Do you like it every time? Or you open up a bottle of wine at the weekend. Just because your friend says it's the best bottle of wine ever, do you have to agree? You don't, you challenge it. But if you're challenging your friend in terms of the bottle of wine's not nice, they will probably turn around and ask, why? And it comes back to that question. Or when you're out at dinner, somebody will probably say, why don't you like your dinner? So you can't just say, I don't like. You must have a justifiable reason as to why. Now, if you turn around and you say that you feel the wine's a little bit too crispy for your particular palate, or if you have a look at your food and you think, I don't know, maybe the food's a little dry, maybe you need a bit more, I don't know, whatever criticism, that is being analytical. So there's two stages to it. Ask the question why and support it with reason justification. They're your two stages to being analytical.
And if you wanted to take that and run even further with it, if you went to an Italian and it said best Italian in Birmingham, would you take their opinion at face value, or would you do a little reading? You'd possibly go on TripAdvisor, you'd go on Facebook, you'd read other reviews, and essentially you would come to your own conclusion supported on what other people have said, and you would try and build a bigger picture around the quality of that statement. That's essentially what a literature review is. I like that analogy. That is a belter. Right. Okay. What are findings and discussion points in a critical literature review when there is no primary data? Roland and I briefly spoke around this in terms of when we are just dealing with secondary data. In terms of Hartbury students, it would be a critical review of the literature. What are their findings and discussion points, Roland, when they don't have access to hard data such as interviews, questionnaires, etc.?
Okay, for what it's worth, in my institute, 95% plus of students do exactly that. They do not do primary research, they do secondary based research only. So I'm quite familiar with this as in terms of being a question. The reality is, if you're doing a secondary based literature review only, so there's no primary data, then everything you find is a finding. By way of example, if you find, for instance, something is no longer in date, earlier we made reference to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that in itself is a finding. If you find, for instance, that there is support, that certain articles support each other, that I don't know, the wine is the best wine or the Italian restaurant is the best Italian restaurant, then that in itself is a finding. If, on the other hand, if you find, for instance, there is contradiction in the literatures, where you find certain literatures contradict other literatures, then again, that in itself is a key finding. So more or less anything you're reading, as long as it's got a relevance, then it's crucial in terms of the finding. I don't know if you can think of any other reasons or points, Alex, on that one.
No, not really. It's pretty spot on there in terms of you're looking for similarities and discrepancies, which
agreed. And you're looking for stuff, whether they're recent or if they're outmoded, whether they're up to date or if they're obsolete, those kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. And location plays an important role as well. So can the findings be transferred from the 1980s in the urban streets of Miami? Are those principles still applicable to Loughborough Sports Academy or Hartbury Sports Academy? Are the key findings there the same? So that's also important, and that can aid with criticality as well, and the sources and the origin of information.
But if you really wanted to go down that road that Alex is talking about, you could look at politics can come into a role, what your political overture is behind it. The papers we read today, if you read the Daily Mail, it's very much pro, for instance, conservative, it's very much anti-Labour. Does that have an impact? We can start to look at issues in terms of the author, their gender. A male will write it from a different perspective to a female. We could go to a finite amount of detail there. The reality is probably keep it more simple than that.
Yeah, I agree. I would say it's definitely one of the harder things to try and conceptualize, but like Roland said earlier on, some of the best papers out there are critical reviews of the literature and are secondary only.
Sorry, Alex, just to maybe give an analogy that might be useful for them. Imagine, for instance, Arsenal are playing Manchester United, okay? And Arsenal score 0 and Manchester United score 6.
Likely, yeah.
We're keeping this realistic. Okay? If we were to look at that from face value, we would turn around and we'd suggest that it was an easy victory for Man United. Okay? But we couldn't leave it there. We would want to look into it and to try and find out what exactly went on. But you wouldn't detail every second of the 90 minutes. You would only look to the crucial points. For instance, goals scored, yellow cards, red cards, any penalty decisions. So you're picking out just the key things to actually appreciate. And that's exactly what you'll do in the literature review. You can't review everything. It's no longer a review. So when it comes to looking for it, you pick out those key points, those key discussion areas that will have the most significance, if you will. You agree, Alex?
Yeah, I would. If I was to really put you on the spot here, and I would say that a dissertation collecting primary data, there is a clear logic and a flow to it. Introduction, background, context, rationale, literature review, methodology, aims and objectives. For me personally, I like them after my lit review. Methodology, findings, discussion, conclusion, recommendations. It's pretty standard across the board as opposed to the structure and the flow that a student can get. What I've found is students very much struggle with the structure of a critical literature review.
Okay, I don't think they should, and I'm preempting what you would ask here.
Yeah.
The only thing that I would change, if you're going to put me on the spot, is I would take the findings element out of the previous sort of structure that you made reference to.
Yeah.
I think, again, you can have your literature review. I think, again, you have to have a methodology for us to understand what literatures you did read.
Yeah.
I think we can go on into a discussion, because remember, a literature review is looking at a review, short, concise overview, if you will.
Yeah.
Where a discussion will take some of those key aspects and really sort of go to town on them, really understand them and appreciate them, and be much more in depth.
Yeah.
And as a result, I think, honestly, you can have the very same structure, less perhaps the findings.
Yeah, I agree. And something my other supervisor said to me was he would constantly go down my work when I'm talking about discussions, and he would say, is there a theory that underpins this? And that often helped me to spark debate around my discussion. So again, it's the old adage of not taking something on face value, but you are looking for the reason why, you are looking for the how, you are looking at the impact. And it really helped me, and I'm sure it helps students, start to think about how that they can discuss these descriptive points.
And that's certainly something that we should look to do. Maybe in a couple of weeks' time, Alex is looking at theory and what is underpinning theory, because that's, again, an area that students struggle a lot with.
Yeah.
If you think literature review are dirty terms, the word theory sends shivers down their spine. So it's certainly something we should sort of stand out, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. If you're up for it, no problem.
Uh-huh.
That's cool. I suppose, really, any final words of advice to a student just about to embark on this crazy journey?
I just wanted to pick up, if you didn't mind, the very last point there. It says, how do you distinguish between a very good literature review from a mediocre literature review? I've been thinking about that one. As Alex rightly mentioned a little bit earlier, we had a quick chat 2 or 3 minutes before we came sort of live. And this one is sort of stuck in my head. What is it that I look for that's different between something that's really good and really just kind of average? Whoa, it's a fantastic question, but I'm going to reverse it around a little bit. When I read a literature review, the first thing I read is actually the summary of that literature review. Because that summary, that kind of conclusion point, brings together the whole sort of discussion, brings together what it is that you were looking at. And if that strikes a chord with me, if I think that's brought together well, then I'm already approaching the literature review in the right frame of mind. And then I can start to see how each of these arguments fit in. But if I'm reading a literature review and I find that the summary piece at the end of it is mediocre, is average, isn't particularly enticing, then actually I approach reading the literature review in that mindset. And with that, it can be very difficult to change my mind. I don't know if you'll be in agreement with that or not, Alex.
Yeah, I would. And I think you've emphasized something that I haven't necessarily thought about too much before, and it is the simple title of a literature review. The fact that it is supposed to be concise, but it's meant to have the key points of your area. And for me, it shouldn't be a surprise, the nature of the study and what you plan on looking at, because it should be made obvious in your argument that your area is needed to be looked at. It should set the scene nicely, looking at key findings with this is another key point that we haven't even spoke about, the over-reliance on one piece of work. That is something that I see all the time, that students will get a good article and they will run with it all the time. For me, a literature review, you need to show that you have read around the topic. So for me, a good literature review is a broad range of sources.
You know, Alex, when these students do that, when they get 1 or maybe 2 articles, then they sort of heavily rely on those.
Yeah.
You know, I frequently give feedback suggesting, well, why didn't I just read those 2 articles?
Spot on.
I mean, what's the point in you writing a literature review if you're largely regurgitating somebody else's work?
Yeah.
It's about being able to draw in from wide sources of literatures and bring that debate together in a nice, concise manner. And some of the other things that I look for in a very good literature review is obviously the references. I like to see that they're up to date and pertinent. I like to see the way something's written. I like to see a crisp, argument. I don't like to see it being dragged out and dragged out as a bore. It needs to be sharp and crisp.
Yep.
I like to see that there is a simple clarity from start to finish in terms of where this particular literature review is going. I'm coming on a journey with you, and I want you to take me by the hand and take me through this literature review without losing me. And in some cases, and I don't know if Alex's university encourages this, but I certainly do in our place, is to bring in signposting, actually putting headings, subheadings along the way, okay? Later you can remove those, but for your benefit, it can be really useful for you to be sort of guided through what you're writing, okay? The last thing that I would suggest in terms of a good literature review, and that is make the arguments presentable. So don't let one argument necessarily spill over into the next argument, etc. Keep them to a degree sort of simplified, individualized to a degree at this stage. Later in your discussion, you can see how these sort of overlap and underpin each other. But in the literature review, keep it nice, crisp, clear, and concise would be my advice.
Yeah, and you don't want to, if you make your point, you don't need to hit me over the head with it multiple times. You can state that the angle, and this is the appreciation and the approach that you're going for. There is not a need to waste words, because you will soon find that you have to cram a lot into your dissertation. You don't have the luxury of it being overly baggy, and I shouldn't be able to go down and remove that sentence and it not take any value away. Every sentence should have a place and it should have value. You don't need to constantly be hitting me over the head with the same message.
Agreed. And I mean, I guess in summary for me to this, I mean, we could talk about a literature review forever, but I guess in summary for me, one of the things that you need to learn, every single student, and I'm still learning it, and I'm sure Alex is still learning it, you need to know when to draw a line underneath it and it's finished. So when you're doing the reading, you need to know when you've done enough reading. I know there's other literatures. I know you could start to read loads more. You could have looked at this. But if you're going to do that, you will never ever complete anything, okay? So know when you've got enough literature, go with it, finish it. And the same when you're constructing a literature review. Construct it, write it, do all those nice things that Alex and myself have been talking about, but then know when to finish it. Know when you put it away and you say that section is now finished, because otherwise you will never ever leave it alone. You'll continually tweak it and go back and readdress it. And I'm speaking from experience, and I know Alex feels exactly the same in this one with me. The more you start to tweak and think you fine tune it, you end up becoming a tinkerman, and to a degree you achieve nothing.
Yeah, it's a good way to end, I think, because there's a difference between overwriting, coming back through and being with a critical eye and narrowing down and getting, there doesn't need to be any excess fat. That's a good way of putting it. And that's one thing. The other thing is I think Peter Principle, I believe, where work expands to fill the time void. And if you continuously say that you're going to write a literature review until it's done, you could spend years on the same literature review, constantly tweaking, new arguments, new way of looking at things. That's why for me, it's so important to have a plan in place from the start, where you have a clear time allocation that after this point, as long as you've given your best and it is a completed piece of work, you have to move on to the next section, because otherwise it's the dominoes effect where that will ruin the next section, that will ruin the next section. And it soon becomes, Roland and I, we will constantly say to each other that we can tell that when a student has put a load of work in and then rushed the ending because they have run out of time. It's a terrible way to finish. You don't ever want to rush a piece of work, and stick to your own deadlines and timescales, because otherwise you can keep editing this for days.
Okay, Alex, the very last thing I want to say, if you don't mind, is I want to leave the students with a little tip, and that is what I call it as bookends. Every single literature review knows, every author knows, you need an introduction and you need a summary. So they're your bookends. You know, no matter what literature review you're writing, those have to be in place. What you don't know is what goes between those. And I advise all my students to set up a skeleton. Write down an introduction, write down a summary, and between it, try and come up with what you would think those headings should be. And that gives you that direction, and it gives you the structure, and it also gives you, if you will, almost a template of what you have to stick to when you're writing that literature review.
I agree. Couldn't agree more.
Excellent. Well done.
Right. I think that's everything. Just a huge thank you for sitting in.
No problem. Most enjoyable.
It is appreciated. I'm sure we will do some others similar, but
absolutely. Definitely going down the road of theory. That's one that I'm certainly looking forward to. And I think there's a few other areas when it comes to research, philosophy, and a few other things down the road that we can cross swords on.
Yeah, definitely.
This is the last thing for me to say is best of luck to all the students, and obviously practices in the sort of reading in this case.
Yeah. All right.
All righty.
Thank you, Roland. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Cheers, buddy. Bye.